Welcome everyone to Global Forum 2022. I'm James Dedarian, the Director of the Center for International Security Studies here at the University of Sydney. I'm hosting today's webinar. We're in the middle of a new Omicron wave in Sydney and following the Vice Chancellor's latest advisory. Plus, we just found out our media space was flooded in the most recent rainstorm. We're going to be coming from an undisclosed location. Actually, my home, which like the university sits on the land of the traditional owners, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I want to acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, the global forums were designed to address the most pressing global issues in a critical and timely manner. And we're very fortunate today to have with us Dr. Alan Cooperman, who teaches military strategy and is coordinator of the Nuclear Proliferation Prevention Project. Does have a website, www.nppp.org, which is located at the LBJ, named after a former president, School of Public Affairs, University of Texas at Austin. Now, Alan has, by way of a title, posed a question for us. Can Albanese, our new prime minister, fix AUKUS? Now, before he provides us with an answer, I want to provide us with some background, because some of you might not be totally familiar with AUKUS or have been following the recent headlines, but it is shorthand for this new trilateral security partnership between Australia, United Kingdom, and the United States, hence the acronym, which was announced with a lot of fanfare over the television screens in the Indo-Pacific region and in Europe. And it's interesting because it sort of ebbs and flows here in Australia in terms of the attention spent on it. And I think it's going to be a critical issue as we get closer to the ramifications of this agreement. And again, I'm calling it an agreement. It's a partnership. It might, quack like a duck. It might look like a duck, but AUKUS is not an alliance. And I think Dr. Cooperman will be speaking to that. It's a partnership. It's an Indo-Pacific expansion of Anglophone special relationship. It was forged, in the words of President Biden, hearkening back to the trench fighting in the First World War, the island hopping of the Second World War, the frigid winters in Korea, and the scorching heat of the Persian Gulf. So it is very much one that was forged in war, which is a bit alarming, of course, for some who see this as more than a partnership, but as something that is leading to a new Cold War with China, to put that on the table. But the partnership, again, he was very explicit, and I quote here, to take on the threats of the 21st century, just as we did in the 20th century, together. So again, might not be called an alliance, but it's a very, very close thing to that. Interesting enough, during the virtual television announcement, the name of the threat went unmentioned. China was not mentioned. Now, I think it's fair to say the news since then has had a mixed reception, depending on which country's press you read. Australia's breaking of a $60 billion contract with the French in favor of a nuclear-powered submarine technology from the US and UK did not go down well in Europe. Stab in the back was one of the headlines that I remember. ScoMo, as our former prime minister is known here, and Bojo, the former prime minister in England, competed for the title of the most perfidious Anglo-Saxon. I'm afraid Prime Minister Johnson replied in less than diplomatic French. He said, "Donnez-moi un break." Morrison kept getting a busy signal whenever he make a phone call to Paris. Albanese had a much better reception when he went, one of his first visits as the prime minister was to go meet with Macron. Now, lost in this media spasm was a much broader commitment of what does it mean to have a strategic partnership? It's important to recognize it's just not about submarines. If you look at the wording in the fine print, it's enhanced by substantial investments, collaborative innovations, and cooperative initiatives, including very, importantly, things like climate change, emerging critical technologies, space exploration, and important to note, coming from a university, higher education. So that's by way of background. I want to make this as interactive a program as possible. So we're going to hear from Dr. Cooperman for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to go right into Q&A. Please use your Q&A function, not the chat function, at the bottom of your screens. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Alan Cooperman. Thank you so much, Alan, for joining us. The screen is yours.
Thanks, James, for that generous, very generous introduction. And I want to thank you and the center and everybody who's helped with the logistics. Today's topic is really timely. Just last week, a major report from China alleged that AUKUS would undermine the nuclear non-proliferation regime. And it called on the International Atomic Energy Agency to block implementation of AUKUS. And just next week, the UN will host the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. That only happens every 5 years, this time 7 years. And at that event, other countries also are expected to criticize Australia and to oppose AUKUS on non-proliferation grounds. Today, I'm going to try to explain that these critics actually have a very good point. But Australia's new Prime Minister, as you mentioned, Anthony Albanese, still has several ways he could modify AUKUS to protect both the non-proliferation regime and Australia's national security. So the title includes this concept of fix AUKUS. Well, what's broken? Here's what. Australia's current plan for AUKUS would undermine a half-century of non-proliferation progress and foster the spread of nuclear weapons to countries and terrorists. That's what's broken. Let me explain why. First, it is necessary to understand that nuclear weapons require one of two materials, either plutonium or highly enriched uranium. If you have one of those, you can build a nuclear bomb, and otherwise not. So, for half a century, the international non-proliferation regime has focused on reducing access to these two materials, including by phasing out all commerce in highly enriched uranium, which we call HEU, and substituting low enriched uranium, we call LEU, which is the fuel in nuclear power plants and which is unsuitable for nuclear weapons. Around the world, 71 nuclear reactors already have converted from HEU to LEU fuel. In addition, for medical isotopes, all of the world's major producers have switched from using HEU to LEU. Even for national security, the US Army has switched its reactors from HEU to LEU fuel, and NASA has switched from HEU to LEU fuel for its planned space reactors. Now, ironically, Australia used to be a leader in this non-proliferation effort. As recently as 2017, Australia signed a UN pledge to, quote, make every effort to achieve further progress with regard to minimizing and eliminating the use of highly enriched uranium in civilian applications, unquote. But now, under AUKUS, Australia would totally reverse course and become by far the world's biggest HEU user of any country that lacks nuclear weapons. The AUKUS submarines would be fueled by tons of 93% enriched uranium, which is drawn directly from the US nuclear weapons stockpile, and which would be sufficient for hundreds of atomic bombs if diverted for that purpose. And this would create a terrible precedent. If Australia not only became the first country without nuclear weapons to acquire submarines, but did so with weapons-grade uranium fuel, then other countries would demand the same right. This could include Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Turkey, Saudi Arabia. I could go on. Many of these countries would demand the same right. Some of them really want nuclear submarines, and others would just want the HEU to build nuclear bombs. So if we go ahead, if Australia goes ahead with this HEU submarine deal, what could the world say to the other countries to stop them? We could say, well, you don't need nuclear submarines. And they'd say, well, Australia needed them. We could say, well, your submarines don't need HEU fuel. And they would say, well, you said Australia's submarines need HEU fuel. And then we could say, well, we don't trust you as much as we trust Australia, so we won't sell you HEU submarines. Would that solve the problem? No, because then they could just turn around and say, we're going to produce our own HEU. And that would actually be even worse. It would give them a clear path to the nuclear bomb, even if they never built the submarines. And it would make the HEU vulnerable to theft by terrorists for nuclear bombs. As a result, inevitably, AUKUS HEU submarines would foster the proliferation of nuclear weapons, which would undermine both Australian and international security. So, what can your Prime Minister Albanese do? In my view, he has three options to fix this. First, he could decide to stick with conventional rather than nuclear submarines. And there would be some benefits to this. Conventional submarines are less expensive, so you can buy more of them. Modern conventional submarines are actually quieter than nuclear submarines, so they're less detectable by your enemy. And as a result, you can provide greater coastal defense with the same amount of money using conventional rather than nuclear submarines. Now, it's true that conventional submarines have a hard time going all the way to the South China Sea without being detected. But Albanese could say that's actually a good thing, because then we won't be antagonizing China, which has nuclear weapons that it could use in retaliation against us. So that's option one. Second option is that Albanese could ask the US for nuclear submarines fueled instead with low enriched uranium. That would set a positive precedent by showing how countries can get nuclear submarines without the proliferation risk of bomb-grade fuel. It would also diffuse China's criticisms, since Australia and the non-proliferation community could say that LEU submarines were actually reinforcing the non-proliferation norm against HEU. Now, the US government, in fact, has been researching LEU fuel for its own submarines for 7 years, and probably could provide LEU submarines to Australia starting in the 2040s, which is when the AUKUS submarines were expected to begin arriving anyway. But critics could claim that LEU would delay delivery of the submarines potentially. Which leads to the third and final option, and that is that Albanese could, instead of buying US and UK submarines, could buy French LEU submarines. And that would have many advantages, and anybody who wants more detail can look at the Lowy Institute website, where I published an article a couple of weeks ago. But let me just tick off some of the advantages. First of all, France already produces and uses LEU-fueled submarines, so there is no technological risk. Secondly, France could provide LEU submarines to Australia about a decade earlier than the US and UK could provide HEU submarines. So that would help deal with what Australia calls the capability gap, as their existing submarines get old and a bit obsolete. Third, French submarines have a crew size about half that of US submarines. And the French crew size is roughly the same as the existing Australian submarine crew size. So with French submarines, Australia's Navy has a chance of actually staffing them. With US submarines, it's maybe an insurmountable challenge to get enough nuclear trained sailors to go on the submarines. Another benefit of the French option, and I should point out, I have no financial or other interest in this option except for non-proliferation. But France has jointly produced submarines in the past with other countries, at least 4 other countries. So some of the production's in France, France, some of the production is in the other countries. So if Australia bought these French nuclear submarines, then a lot of the construction would be in Australia. By contrast, the US has never, ever jointly produced a submarine with another country. And so it's possible some of the construction would be done in Australia, but that would be a new thing for the US and a very sharp learning curve. In addition, the French have experience trying to incorporate the US combat system into their submarines. The deal that you mentioned, James, that Morrison scuttled was for a conventional French submarine with the US combat system. So France has been thinking for years about how to incorporate the US combat system into the French submarine platform. And that means if Australia bought LEU submarines from Australia, they would be fully interoperable with the US Navy, which I know is a major concern for your Ministry of Defense. And then finally, since these French submarines are smaller, they probably would cost less than the US or UK versions. And that leaves extra money for Australia's Ministry of Defense to spend on other technologies that might be equally or more important for the security environment going forward. So those are the three options that Albanese had. And what I would say in summary is that Australia is facing a really momentous decision. Middle-sized countries like Australia don't often affect the course of international relations. But in this case, I believe Australia's choice of submarine fuel could well determine the fate of the global non-proliferation regime. So thanks again for inviting me, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Alan. There's plenty, I think, to spark discussion and perhaps even a little controversy, which is good. It's our motto at the Center for International Security Studies that we progress on these critical issues through dissent. We shouldn't always be in agreement. So we really thank you for providing that today. We all too often get into groupthink. And I'm going to start off by just saying that, you know, what if we zoom out a bit, what if we look at this, you know, weapon systems in some ways are the tail that wags the dog of, you know, policy. As you do point out, that we get sort of locked into a weapon system. Next thing you know, our military doctrine gets locked in the way that a lot of wars have started from the First World War, getting locked into train timetables to meet the war game plans of the Schlieffen, General Schlieffen and the General Staff, to you know, how various war games got it wrong about Iraq and led to various policies. I'm thinking in this case really about how are we preparing for the wrong war? That's one question. But secondly, what does this mean for the nature of other alliances? And I'll just give you one brief anecdote to sort of illustrate this point. I mean, the last book that I was researching and working on was all about the military industrial media entertainment network, as I called it. It's a mouthful. But I used to go to these trade shows. And they would fill these large convention halls with, you know, weapon systems and computers, the defense industries, and big tech would be there. But there's this one small booth that just really caught my attention. And it had in it what looked like a pretty large torpedo, but it had these articulated wings and on top solar panels. And as I found out, in what would have been, you know, in the nose cone a weapon, was a computer with artificial intelligence, very primitive at the time, that allowed this to be an autonomous submersible drone. And it was powered by solar, but also powered by these tapping the energy in waves to power its motor. And I just looked at this and I thought, okay, if you weaponize this, or if you just use it as a sensor, what does this mean for submarines? That's one question. And the other question is really related to this, is like how the other aspect of AUKUS, this collaboration on emerging technologies, you know, the quantum was mentioned in it, and our other hat we wear here at CIS is doing a project for DFAT, the Ministry of Diplomacy here and Foreign Affairs. And it is really the case that you have to ask, I believe, in looking at quantum technologies, whether quantum communications, quantum computers, quantum sensors are going to make the whole stealthiness of the submarine jeopardized. And what does that mean for the triad of nuclear defense, which is very much part of military and foreign policy in this alliance? So I'm going to really focus just briefly first on the tech and what it means, the ramifications for the alliances. But feel free to seize on any of the other aspects of these observations or questions.
Thanks. That's, I heard a few questions in there, and some of them really related to weapons and tactics, and others related more, I think, to strategy. So I'll start with the former. I'm sympathetic to the underlying principle that I think undergirds your question about weapons and tactics, which is something we were all taught as children, which is don't put all your eggs in one basket. And it is true that as far as we know, US submarines, nuclear submarines, are undetectable. That's both attack submarines, which are the type that Australia wants to purchase under AUKUS, and also ballistic missile submarines, which are the what we consider to be the most secure aspect of nuclear deterrence, as you referred to the triad, which is ground-based nuclear weapons, air-based nuclear weapons, and submarine-based nuclear weapons. And there are considered to be clear vulnerabilities for land-based and clear vulnerabilities for air-based, and we consider submarines to be invulnerable. But as you say, that's the result of the current state of not just technology, but tactics. And if you look at military history through the centuries, you see that sometimes a change in technology flips the military balance, and sometimes it's a change in tactics with no change in technology. We look at blitzkrieg. Well, we had tanks in World War I, but they didn't change the military balance. It was only the tactics of blitzkrieg that converted the existing technology into a flipping of the military balance from the defense having the advantage to the offense having the advantage. Sorry, I got a little professorial there, but you're a university, so I'm allowed to do that.
Absolutely.
And so to your question, yeah, submarines seem great now. Nuclear submarines seem great now tactically, but one change in technology or one change in tactics or some synergy between tactics and technology, and all of a sudden they might not seem so great. And so that's why you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. And we haven't talked a lot about cost, but there was a recent estimate from ASPE down in Canberra, and they estimate that the purchase price of the AUKUS submarines will be about 171 billion Australian dollars. And if you go that route, you don't have a lot left over in your military budget for other things. And so it's pretty close to putting all your eggs in one basket. I also saw an op-ed by a legislator who recently left your legislature, Rex Patrick, former submariner, and he made the same case. Said we could buy many more conventional submarines for a lot less money, so we would have better coastal defense, and then we would have a lot of money left over for other technologies if it turns out that submarines are not the game changer for defense or for the next war. So I'm not endorsing fully his views, but the basic idea of not relying on a single weapon system. I can also point to history, to France in the interwar period, saying, oh, well, we got attacked by Germany the last time, so we'll build the Maginot Line and we'll put all our money into that and we'll be immune from attack. And lo and behold, that worked, but the Germans went around the Maginot Line and through the forest and conquered France in 6 weeks. So yeah, don't put all your eggs in one basket, I would certainly agree with. So just briefly on your other questions, you asked, is Australia preparing for the wrong war, and you asked, what about other alliances? And so to the first question, the way I think about it is, yes, nuclear submarines allow you to go to the South China Sea and to threaten Chinese assets, both on sea. For example, there's their submarines as they leave the coast of China, and their ground-based assets. So absolutely gives you an enhanced ability to attack China. And the question is, why do you want an enhanced ability to attack China? And the way I hear it is that, well, we want to, if things get spicy, if we want to be able to deter China by threatening it. And also, if the war starts, we want to be able to get in some early shots to potentially shift the military balance. Those are plausible arguments, but one of the things we teach about when we teach military strategy is the security dilemma. And that is these things that Australia thinks, this weapon system that Australia thinks has something to defend itself, only for defensive purposes, only for deterrent purposes. When China looks at it, it is going to look at it as an offensive weapon from Australia versus China. It is going to look at Australia as threatening China. And so in a crisis, China might say, we have to attack Australia first because it's threatening to attack us. And then you look at this unavoidable fact, which is that China has nuclear weapons and Australia doesn't have nuclear weapons. And so Australia cannot deter a nuclear attack on Australia. Now think of this crisis, think of this next war. Australia and the US are in a war with China. China wants to use nuclear weapons to stop things, to say we're really serious, to deter any further attack. Who is China going to attack? The US mainland, when the US can retaliate with nuclear weapons, or the Australian mainland, where Australia can't retaliate with nuclear weapons? So in a sense, Australia getting nuclear submarines to threaten to attack China could provoke a nuclear power, China, to attack Australia with weapons that Australia cannot deter. So, again, I'm not saying nuclear submarines are a bad idea for Australia, but that issue, that logic train about how nuclear submarines could backfire by provoking a Chinese attack, even a nuclear attack on Australia, needs to be much more of the debate. I didn't hear it in the Morrison government, and sadly, I haven't heard a rethinking of it. And when I met with the government, it seemed as if they were telling me, we don't plan to rethink that basic decision.
No.
And that's really shocking and disappointing, because the Labor government, in my view, never would have come up with this AUKUS plan on its own. And now it's just taking this ball from September 2021 and is just running with it. When instead of thinking about, is this a good idea? I mean, this is it's 20 years till you get your first submarine. It's probably 30 years till you get your last submarine. These submarines last for 30 years. So you have a 60-year plan, okay, that is only a few months old. Why not take a little time, Albo, and think about it? Is this really what we want to do with the bulk of our military resources for the next 60 years? And the answer might be no. And then just the last thing, sorry to go on for so long, but you mentioned other alliances, and I'll refer to other relationships. One of the great things about this new government is your foreign minister, Penny Wong, coming out and saying, we really care about the region. We really care about our neighbors. To some extent, previous governments have neglected to forge relationships and strengthen relationships in the neighborhood. And of course, we saw the Chinese deal with the Solomon Islands just recently, which potentially puts your existential enemy in an alliance with a little country right near you. And what I heard from the foreign minister is we're really going to double down on reinforcing our relationships. in the neighborhood. Well, all I can tell you is that a lot of the countries in the neighborhood, including Indonesia, are very, very unhappy with the AUKUS deal, and specifically the nuclear submarine aspect of the AUKUS deal. And they've already voiced that, and I think they're likely to voice that again at this non-proliferation treaty review conference at the UN in New York starting on August 1. So you have two planks of national security policy in Australia. One is AUKUS and one is rebuilding relationships with the region, and they are at cross purposes, and something's going to have to give. And I really hope that the Albanese government is thinking about that.
Yeah, that's a combination of informative, professorial, and scary. I think let me start with the professorial. And you do have this scenario that if things escalate in this region, it boils down to the question, would the US decision makers at this point, in a crisis moment where you have very little decision-making time, say, okay, we're willing to possibly lose New York for Sydney to protect Sydney. That's what the game theory is about. And it reminded me of something that happened in the 1980s with the decision to base intermediate nuclear weapons in Europe, which created a similar debate. Would the US sacrifice Chicago for Hamburg? And because the SS-20s being put forward based by the Soviet Union threatened very short period of delivery time, the major capitals and cities of Europe. And then it became well, you need a counterforce. We need to put Pershing and cruise missiles in. In some ways, we're doing a maritime equivalent of this. So the question I get, or the observation is, can weapon systems tighten alliances and increase deterrence? Now, some people would say, yeah, it worked, in Europe. It did deter and led to the beggaring of the Soviet Union with increased expenditures. But it is also scary to think that, the Australian budget's going to be beggared by this too. We'll have enough money based on those figures you just quoted, to buy a few F-35s and maybe one or two, USS Virginia or the astute, submarines that are being considered. It seems to lack a realism, and here it seems that the realist, in the sense of the School of International Relations that looks at like nation states pursuing self-interest, as opposed to put all their eggs in one basket, in this case, an alliance system based on belief system that someone will come to your aid when things escalate. Kissinger, 99 years old, comes out with an op-ed just this weekend about this, saying, well, Australia, maybe you want to reconsider, depending too much on the United States, start talking to China a bit more. And then, of course, Hugh White just recently had a very long piece, very thoughtful, but very critical piece of current Australian policy, which is saying, we're sleepwalking to war. And that's, of course, an analogy to another pre-war situation, First World War. Now, all analogies at some level are false, but we have to learn from history in this case. I put 1980 up there, I put First World War. You put those, Blitzkrieg on the table. Are we learning from that? And I would just, donning my professorial hat, also say that, Blitzkrieg originated in actually the doctrine of putting together radios, armored vehicles, and troops in war games in Britain on Salisbury Plain in the 30s. Little Hart is writing about this in the Daily Telegraph, these incredible war games. But the British didn't implement that strategy because they didn't have to. They won the last war, scarecrows. It's the losers who learned the lessons. So in some ways, China might learn some of these lessons that we're talking about much more quickly, or other countries that suffered greatly in previous wars or for other reasons. So all those are, I think it's a good reason to step back, not to endorse one position, but step back and say, okay, let's take a hard look of the, unintended consequences, the historical lessons, and also, what can you really afford? And I think you've done us a service in mapping that out. I'm going to give an opportunity for others to ask questions, but if you want to respond to any of that first.
The first part of your comments were about what I would call extended deterrence, which is, can a country like the US, which has nuclear weapons, help deter attacks on other countries that don't have nuclear weapons? And where that has worked, again, we know that at least we have circumstantial evidence that it worked, in the sense that there weren't Soviet attacks on US allies in Western Europe or East Asia during the Cold War, even though those countries didn't have nuclear weapons. But even the US didn't have faith that just a promise would be sufficient to deter or to be a credible deterrent against the Soviets. And so what we did is we also stationed troops right on the border where of the Warsaw Pact alliance, the Soviet-led alliance. Many troops in Germany, West Germany, many troops in South Korea. And the reason we did that is because we were saying to the Soviets, if you attack, you're going to kill Americans. And you know, Pearl Harbor, when you kill Americans, we get really mad, and we unleash major retaliation against you. That bolstered the credibility of the US extended deterrence. That's not what you have in Australia. If China nukes Australia, it's not killing Americans. I'm sorry to put it in such blunt terms, but the US is, as a result, less credible in saying that we are going to extend our deterrence to Australia than we were in saying we're extending our deterrence to Japan, South Korea, and West Germany, where there are lots of American troops in what we call a tripwire. So that's the first thing I'll say. And then just about old Henry Kissinger, all I can say is that if a country decides that another country, in this case, Australia, decides China is an existential threat and plans for war against China, that can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think that's possibly part of what was driving Kissinger's argument. And that instead, if you realize China has some legitimate national interests, it is a major power, it is going to have the largest economy in the world. There are certain things that China considers vital interests and other things that are peripheral interests. And if you try to deal with China and not antagonize and threaten its vital interests, you might have a cooperative rather than confrontational relationship. And you might get a win-win outcome as opposed to a lose-lose outcome. And that's when you flip from the realist school of international relations to more of a liberal cooperative one. So anyway, that's just some brief responses.
Is it possible, I mean, I know this is almost like a third rail, if you talk about something like a more non-aligned position by, or a new alliances of non-aligned countries, to the extent that's possible, in this, to break this almost what you say, and I think is a self-fulfilling prophecy, moving towards a bipolarization, called a new Cold War, whatever, in the region. I just curious, because right now, I almost feel like Hugh White's sort of shouting into the wind, and no one's picking up on it. And he's a very respected, scholar and strategist, but there's almost like some topics that you can't go near. And this is increasingly turning into an enforced silence, or, a zone of non-discourse. And I'm concerned enough about it that I'm thinking, that's why we, of course, we welcome the opportunity to hear your voice, but also, well, it's important to hear these voices. I mean, the Israelis, for instance, always have that 10th guy in the room whose sole purpose is to be, the dissenting red team, to challenge the group think. And I don't think we're sleepwalking, because sleepwalking suggests too close an analogy to prior to the First World War, where I think the interdependence, the complex interdependence of at a global level, but also between China, even with all the current tariffs and trade barriers, it's just too densely interwoven to compare step by step with what happened in the First World War. But I do see parallels with military planning, with the way that the weapon systems are the tail wagging the dog here. That's one of my concerns, and I'm just wondering how you feel that. What's the take in your view from the foreign policy circles around Biden? What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, first thing I'll say is that AUKUS was not the Biden administration's idea. Right. It was Scott Morrison's idea, and reportedly his intelligence head, Andrew Shearer, who came up with this idea, took it to the UK and then took it to the US. From the US perspective, AUKUS is great because Australia is going to buy 8 more submarines for the US Navy. That's the way I think a lot of people in the US military think about this, that those Australian nuclear submarines won't be able to act autonomously. They'll only be able to act with the US military. And so they're a force multiplier for the US Navy. And the US Navy year after year says, we need more submarines. We need more submarines. And there's just not enough money in the budget. And so now Australia is ponying up, 100 or 200 billion bucks to enhance the US nuclear naval capability. So again, that's maybe not a popular interpretation in Australia, but I think, from the US perspective, when Australia said, hey, can we buy 8 nuclear submarines and have them operate under, your joint command? The US is like, sure, why not? And again, no nonproliferation officials were in the room to ask, well, HEU or LEU, just to get back to my original point. And then by the time the nonproliferation officials got in the room, it was too late to put that on the table. So, but as to this, question of, is there a third way? Is there a way for Australia and its neighbors to essentially be neutral? And now we get to the third major branch of international relations theory, which is constructivism, which can countries say essentially we're opting out of this game between the big boys and be left alone. And historically, some countries have managed to thread that needle because the big powers view it in both of their interests to allow these other countries to be neutral, to avoid fighting over them, to reap benefits of economic cooperation with them. So it's possible theoretically, but can the Australian government and people do that? Can they essentially cut the umbilical cord from the US? And I'll tell you, coincidentally, I went to an event at a veterans facility here in Australia. I think you call them RSL, Return Service League. And all you see are photos of all of the wars that either the UK started or got into, or the US started or got into, and then Australia just joined on. And some of them were really not very smart wars, whether it's the Gulf War or whether it's the Vietnam War. But always side by side. And the US appreciates that. We really appreciate that. And I think Australia gets a sense of security by always being there with the US, and that therefore the US will always be there for them. And so I think culturally it would be very, very hard for the Australian military and even the Australian people to consider cutting that tie. It might be the right thing to do, might not, but I think practically very, very, very challenging.
Yeah, was it Lord Palmerston who said there are no permanent friends, only permanent interests?
Yeah,
that was sort of the realist perspective on that one. I'm sure one that Henry Kissinger would quote, or Hugh White and others. But you bring up the constructivist, and there has been a variety of moments and efforts in the Indo-Pacific that seem to be forgotten to set up something like that a third way, be it from the non-aligned movement in between the Soviet Union and the US, especially at a time of ratcheting up escalations in the Indian Ocean, where, the zone of peace was actually twice voted through the UN, but then vetoed by Soviet Union and the United States over stationing, setting up a naval base in Diego Garcia, et cetera. Interestingly enough, China voted for that zone of peace at the time. I don't know if they would now. We said, okay, let's have a zone of peace in South Asian Sea or whatever. And but it's just to put it out there, it's not a total folly that there have been these efforts.
And there is a nuclear weapon-free zone in Southeast Asia.
Yes, around New Zealand, and yes, of course, and other islands. So there is a precedent. But then there's also that 900-pound gorilla in the room, which is the Ukraine-Russian war. How people are interpreting that. Is this a result of appeasing an aggressor, or is it a result of a provocative, extended NATO alliance right on the borders of Russia? This debate's ongoing, and it's not going to, be resolved until the war is, which we all hope is sooner rather than later. But it is, people are watching this very closely for the lessons learned. What lessons are you learning from the Ukraine and Russia?
Yeah, I would say I'm not in the mainstream on interpreting that war. I've written about this. I've spoken about it on TV. I think that for a few decades, the US-led Western alliance, the kids used to say they dissed Russia. They disrespected Russia in essentially saying that NATO can gobble up all of these former Warsaw Pact countries, and even countries, former republics of the Soviet Union. And Russia's just supposed to take it. And then we can even offer NATO membership to two countries that Russia considers very much in its vital sphere of influence. And Russia just has to take it. And there was pushback in 2014 after the US really did help. It's very documented. We helped overthrow a democratically elected leader of Ukraine in 2013. And that led to a Russian incursion into Ukraine. Russia was trying to say, we're really, really serious about this. We really consider this our sphere of influence. You have pushed too far. We can't take it anymore. And what popped out of that in 2015 was the Minsk II agreement, where Ukraine said, okay, we understand you're stronger, we're weaker. We'll have a deal where the pro-Russian parts of Ukraine will have a degree of political autonomy within Ukraine. And then Russia can have its influence there. That'll prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, and we can solve this thing peacefully. And what happened after 2015 is that for 7 years, Ukraine's government refused to implement that deal that they had signed. And Putin kept saying, I'm getting mad, I'm getting frustrated, I'm gonna do something about this, I'm putting 100,000 troops on the border, I'm really serious, you better implement that peace agreement. And Ukraine didn't. And the reason Ukraine didn't is they thought they had a promise from the West to defend them. And what, in my opinion, the West should have done is said, hey, Ukraine, we love you, but we don't want to have a big old war over this. And so do the reasonable thing, keep your country intact, but have political autonomy for this area called the Donbass. And we should have done that, but we didn't. Instead, we said, this is completely up to Ukraine. We totally respect and defend Ukraine's right to make its own decisions. We won't say that Ukraine won't be a member of NATO, which just encouraged Ukraine to think they would be a member of NATO. And Ukraine basically told Putin to go to hell. And Putin said, all right, last straw. Now we have a military solution. To me, that's how the war happened. So now let's think about Asia. Now let's think about Asia. And China also has its red lines. And we need to be respectful of those red lines. The most important one right now is Taiwan. And so what you want to do is not sacrifice Taiwan, but make sure that vis-a-vis Taiwan, you don't cross that red line. You don't show so much support for Taiwan that they think they can declare independence, because that would provoke a war with China. And it might make the Ukraine war look, like a walk in the park. So for me, that's the lesson. Respect the vital interests of seriously strong countries with seriously threatening weapons, and don't gratuitously disrespect them and provoke them. And you might be able to work through these things peacefully.
Okay, well, that's going to be probably the topic for our next global forum. We had one preliminary, but that certainly opened up a lot. I would just share one story with you. Shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, George Soros, who's vilified often in many circles, did something pretty remarkable. He put up a lot of money to bring academics to the former Soviet republics to help teach something other than Marxist-Leninism as a way of looking at the world. And I ended up in Vilnius teaching. And Vilnius, Lithuania, the capital.
Yeah, I'm a Litvak, so yes, I get it.
Oh, no kidding. Oh, there you go. Well, I was on the Baltic Peace and Freedom Cruise, so I have some credentials on my Latvian friends, Lithuanian and Estonian friends. But anyways, I was there, and I had a small grant. I went around to different embassies and did interviews, and I'll never forget the interview I did with this very cosmopolitan, former Soviet, now Russian ambassador. We talked a lot about security issues and everything else. And I thought, well, what's your view on the future? And he says, well, if any of these states, meaning the Baltic states, join NATO, there will be war in Europe. He didn't give a date. He just said, there will be, I know, not the leadership now, but I know the leadership that it will come into Russia if this is provoked. It'll be nationalist, it'll be chauvinist, it'll be probably aggressive. And sure enough, we got Putin after Yeltsin, and then we got war. And I'll never forget that, because this is a man who knew history. He wasn't a nationalist. He wasn't, for that matter, a Soviet ideologue. So I've always kept that in the back of my head when I saw this happening, this forward-leaning NATO, call it what you will, expansion. And it's going to be an ongoing debate that, about appeasement versus deterrence versus escalation. But I tend to lean in your direction on this assessment based on my experiences of teaching in those regions, doing interviews, but also history. I mean, our history is our best lesson here. And, all great powers have messed up when they believe that their way is the right way. We did it certainly in Iraq, and Australia joined that, I think, folly to the loss of a lot of treasure and a lot of blood, as they say. Our movie, the documentary film we made about human terrain, about enlisting American academics in the war effort, brought that home, because we, in some ways, we have to take positions where self-declared neutrality is not recognized during wartime often. We've learned that. And I think we do have to take positions. So I applaud you for taking a position on this one I know that you've probably taken some hits. And anytime you'd like to come back and take some further hits in Australia, you're more than welcome. I've been trying to weave some questions in from various folks that have been coming by email and other sources, but I just want to give one last opportunity if anybody has anything we haven't touched on.
In the meantime, can I give a quick?
Yes, I was going to say, please give us your
just so
final thoughts on
that. Just vis-a-vis the Ukraine thing, I don't, people sometimes say, are you saying Ukraine doesn't have the right to independence and the right to sovereignty over all of its territory and the right to join whatever alliance it picks? And that's not what I'm saying. I'm not denying what rights they have. I'm just, as you were alluding to, just pointing to the realities of international politics. And you can't ignore those. You can't address the world as you wish it was. You have to address the world as it really is. And if insisting on all of Ukraine's rights leads to the destruction of Ukraine, that's probably counterproductive. So it's not a matter of am I denying rights? I'm just trying to think of what's really in Ukraine's interest. And, if we just want to stay out and they still want to defy Russia, even without our support, that's their choice. My concern is we were giving them support that was encouraging them to defy Russia in a way that would lead to the destruction of Ukraine, as it really has to large swaths of Ukraine. So that's the first thing. And then you also mentioned, this debate about appeasement, and one of the great leaders in our field just passed away this last year, and that's Robert Jervis at Columbia University. And one of his great insights, building on Morgenthau, one of his great predecessors in international relations theory, is that appeasement is not always bad. Appeasing Hitler is always bad, but not everybody is Hitler. And so what Morgenthau said and what Jervis teased out is that if a country has a demand, but it's a very discrete demand and a very reasonable demand, and if you meet that demand, that's it. The hunger will not grow with the eating. The appetite will not grow with the eating. Then the smart thing to do is to appease that kind of country making that kind of demand. And if you don't appease that, then you're going to get an unnecessary war, which is lose-lose. So, and again, it's very, very hard in the political arena to say, we should appease so-and-so. So I never say that just because it clangs on the ears.
Yes,
but the principle of, countries have reasonable demands, and you should meet those reasonable demands to avoid unnecessary wars. That's really, really important in international relations and international security.
Since you have cited some of the great thinkers, I'll end with one of my memories of Hedley Bull's last public presentations before he died very prematurely. Australian transported to I can't use that term, transported, I guess, in Australia. But he ended up at Oxford, and he was my mentor. He supervised my dissertation and was a great influence. But one of his last presentations was to BBC, and it was at the height of this debate about cruise and Pershing missiles, and then the negotiations over the reduction of intermediate nuclear forces. And he went on BBC because he strongly advocated that Europe develop its own self-defense. It maintain its independence. Can't do it individually. It should not rely on the United States, because the United States would not be dependable if it came to a war. That they need to develop their own either conventional or nuclear deterrent. He didn't specifically say, conventional or nuclear at that point, but he did say that Europe had to get its act together, and that might come out of the Ukrainian. If we're trying to find some silver lining, that there will be blocks. There might be an Indo-Pacific bloc. It could be Australia, and it takes a more independent route with Japan, Korea, maybe even India, who knows? And it could be that Europe does. And then you have a true multipolarity, or as I like to call it, a heteropolarity, where, you have not just nation states and reconfiguring this balance of power, but other actors as well. So maybe we'll save all this. I think we've raised a lot of provocative points, new questions. And as I said, we value dissent. I think we move forward through getting these different perspectives. So thank you very much, Dr. Alan Cooperman from the University of Texas at Austin. His website is, if you Google his name, on nonproliferation. If you want to say it one more time, feel free to.
It's www.nppp.org.
All right. Well, thank you again, Alan. We hope to have you back. And I'm sorry we couldn't do it in person, but next time, all things willing, we hope we can do this in front of a live audience. And until then, stay well, stay healthy, everybody. Be good, be kind, and over and out. So thank you again.
Thank you.